Is there any estimates for the number of people, of Bushman people that were there, say in the 1600s? And how densely populated was South Africa? And what part of Africa exactly are we talking about? Like, Africa's a wallopingly big continent, despite the Mercator projection. And so, and the people who Americans think of as black, they occupy Africa south of the Sahara Desert, but fundamentally north of where South Africa is. Like, how far up were the Bushmen, how far to the north were the Bushmen the predominant human population in the 1600s?
Well, that's a very important point. So they occupied, there were several thousands. I don't know if they were 100,000. I'm not sure. We can check those numbers.
Yeah.
But they lived pretty much all over South Africa, and they lived more to the eastern part, which is important because the eastern part is much more fertile land. It's much more humid, and that's where the most productive farming land is, and so forth.
Right.
The western part is arid. It's more deserts and dry, and so forth.
So they lived mostly in the east.
Yes, but they don't anymore, and that's important because, so if you go to the eastern parts, like the Drakensberg, you would find the cave paintings of the Khoi and the San, but they don't live there anymore because they were pushed out by groups coming in from the north, who, it has become a controversial term, although I don't know what the appropriate term then would be, by the Bantu people. So the word Bantu is a word that means people. It just means people.
That's typical anthropologically. Most tribes refer to themselves as the humans, as opposed to everyone else who aren't the humans.
Exactly. So they've been known as the Bantu-speaking groups, but today it's controversial to use that term.
Why is that?
Because it's a term that refers to black people. And I think some people have used the term in the context of making derogatory remarks or something to that effect.
I see. Okay.
But that's how they were known historically. And that's the Zulus and the Xhosas and the different groups that we know in South Africa today.
And they came down from the north.
They came down from the north, and they pushed out the Bushmen.
Right.
Yes.
Now, also the Bushmen, from what I understand, and I don't know lots about the Bushmen either, although what I do know about them is that they were basically hunters and gatherers and trackers, and that they were very sophisticated at
very
that.
nomadic.
Right? They had those little lightweight bows and arrows and the poison darts, and they're very good at running down prey. Right, and they can live where no one else can live. But also, they weren't agriculturalists, from my understanding, and there were no places where the Bushmen produced like cities or dense population centers.
Correct, and they are fairly small also, which is one of the reasons why when the bigger tribes came in from the north and there was conflict between these groups, they were pushed out. They were not able to take a stance against the Zulu people, who are typically a strong nation.
Right, and very, well armed comparatively
speaking. Very militaristic, yes.
Right. The Bushmen have those little bows and arrows with their poison darts, but those don't make very effective weapons of war, partly because the poison is long-acting.
Yes, exactly.
And for all those people who think, by the way, that the Bushmen were like peaceful agrarian communists, and that there was no conflict amongst them, let's say, prior to the Bantu or the Europeans. The most common, if I remember correctly, the most common pathway to death for a Bushman man is through murder. So you can use those darts on other people quite effectively if there's a feud. I also know that the Bushmen, because they lived in small tribal groups, they didn't evolve a real judicial system, and often their disputes would turn murderous. And so in some of these areas where the Bantus, for example, came down, the Bushmen would use the Bantu judicial system, which was more advanced, as a means of mediating their own disputes. So I just want to bring that up to put to rest any suspicions that the Bushmen, for example, were Rousseau noble savages, and that everything was peaceful before civilization came along. It's like, that's not how the world works, even a little bit. Okay, so in the 1650s, the Europeans came to the very southern tip of Africa, and that was primarily a consequence of the trading routes, because people had to sail around the Horn.
Yes.
Right, and they set up this settlement as a refreshment station, you said, for the sailors, and that would be the European sailors who were starting to trade in India and so forth.
Exactly, yes.
And in Asia.
And also to service the ships, building ships, repairing ships, and so forth, yes. So that they started there in 1652. Eventually, they had what we call the Vryburgers or the Freeburgers, which was that some of the They were employees of the Dutch East India Company. Some of them were then released from their contracts so that they could become farmers, so that they could start developing an economy. And so there were some clashes with, for example, the Bushmen already there in the Cape, between the Europeans and the Bushmen, but there was also examples of trading and cooperation and so forth.
Right, so that's similar to what happened in North America.
Yeah.
Like there were lots of peaceful and productive interactions between the natives and the Europeans, and it also depended on which Europeans. So the Cree in Canada were much more likely to ally with the English, for example, than with the French. And so these things were very common.
We had the same dynamics in South Africa with the Afrikaner people and the English as well, yes. And so, but just to get to that point, it's unfortunate that thinking about history tends to overestimate or overemphasize the conflict and downplay the cooperation, because conflict is more newsworthy, you could say. So when we think about history, we think about war and conflict, but we forget the cooperation part. That's very important.
Right.
And so that was about the time when the Zulu people were settling in what is today KwaZulu-Natal, and that calls our people in what is the Eastern Cape, closer to where the Afrikaners or the Proto-Afrikaners were. And
so when did the Bantu start moving south? And why hadn't they done that before?
I'm not sure why they haven't done that before, but from what I know, there was conflict up north in Africa, and there was nomadic tribes and some groups
So they were pushed down as a consequence of intertribal warfare in their own lands.
Yes.
It's still surprising, isn't it, that so much of Africa was essentially unsettled. I mean, I know the Bushmen were there, but there weren't very many of them. And it's also a lifestyle that can't support that huge a population. It's pre-agricultural lifestyle.
Yep.
So, I mean, there weren't very many human beings 100,000 years ago. So, okay. And so, all right. So the Europeans start settling in the southernmost part of Africa. It's the Dutch East India Company. It's primarily for trade. The employees of that company get acclimated to Africa. They realize that there's immense productive farmland there. Like I read, for example, I know Uganda's farther north, but Uganda has enough arable land to feed all of Africa with no problem. Yeah. And a water table that's 200 feet below the surface of the country that's virtually everywhere in the country. Yeah. Right, so God only knows how many people Africa could support if it was well managed.
Yes, which is why we have some of the best farmers in South Africa today. Yeah. So in terms of the history, then one major event was with the Napoleonic Wars. We sometimes joke as the Afrikaner people, we say we skipped the Enlightenment because we have this joke. We say in Europe they were reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau while we were hunting elephants.
That was probably a better use of time than reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau anyways.
Yeah, so but that's important because I think it in a way shaped our culture in a particular way, and which is why the Afrikaner people at least are much more conservative, much more religious than many of our friends in Europe.
Data brokers, those invasive tech companies, spy on your online activity, compromising your freedom. They monitor every click, action, and word, then compile and sell this information to corporations and foreign governments. These entities don't care about your welfare. That's why we use ExpressVPN, a company dedicated to protecting you from these Big Brother surveillance operations. With ExpressVPN, your entire online activity flows through secure, encrypted tunnels, ensuring complete privacy. No one, no data brokers, big tech companies, or even your internet provider can track your online behavior. ExpressVPN masks your IP address, the digital identifier that enables data brokers to collect and sell your information to questionable companies. That's why we at the Daily Wire are proud to partner with ExpressVPN. Both our hosts and production teams rest easy amidst their busy travel schedules, knowing their data isn't being compromised or sold regardless of where they're using the internet. Plus, for U.S. customers, ExpressVPN's new Identity Defender feature removes your data from brokers' databases, monitors the dark web for your compromised information, and alerts you to unauthorized social security number usage. Using ExpressVPN is about defending your fundamental right to privacy. As our lives increasingly move online, more of our personal information becomes vulnerable to surveillance. Protect yourself with ExpressVPN today. Find out how you can get 4 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or by going to expressvpn.com/JordanYT.
Should outline a little bit, probably, too, the conflict between the Dutch, the Boers, and the English.
Yes, I want to get to that now.
Okay. So we've got the setup now. So really, what happened in South Africa was that there was a relatively small population of pre-agricultural tribesmen, the Bushmen, who were very ethnically distinct from the, let's call them Central Africans for the time being.
Yes,
and that in around 1600, 1650, let's say to 1750, there was an influx of Bantu-speaking people who were larger from the north, and there was an influx of Europeans
It was a bit before, I think they came in before the Europeans came, but they were coming in from the north in the same century, you could say.
Okay, in the same century anyways.
Yeah.
And so the Bushmen were starting to feel pressure from an invasion, so to speak, from the north, and also an influx from the south.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a more accurate, and none of this was agricultural to begin with.
Yes.
Right. So now were the Bantu also interested in agricultural settlement?
Yes, they were less nomadic than the Bushmen. The Bushmen were more nomadic. They moved around much more. And the Bantu groups were also in a sense nomadic, but they settled in, like the Zulus built the Zulu kingdom in KwaZulu-Natal, in the eastern part of the country. And they had more degrees of settlement.
Okay, so we're also seeing an anthropological struggle in the broader sense between the archaic mode of human existence, which was nomadic hunter-gatherer, and the developing agricultural and settled communities. Some of them were black in Africa and some of them were white.
Yep.
And so now we've got at least a three-way conflict going on, not counting the conflicts between inside the groups.
Yes.